Spring 1940. The skies over England have become a theatre of death. RAF pilots, young men barely out of their adolescence, climb into their Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing that each flight could be their last. But the enemy isn't just the Luftwaffe. There's another killer in the clouds, one that doesn't discriminate between friend and foe, the carburetors of their own aircraft. During high-speed combat dives, the engines cut out. The aircraft loses power at the worst possible moment, when the pilot needs it most. In the split second between life and death, between shooting down the enemy or being shot down, the Merlin engine fails. The plane plummets. The pilot fights desperately to restart it. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. The official reports speak of mechanical failures. The pilots speak of death sentences. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, engineers work around the clock searching for solutions, complex theories, sophisticated modifications, months of testing. But the war doesn't wait for perfection. Every day that passes, more pilots die. Among these engineers, there's a woman, Beatrice Shilling. In a world dominated by men, where female presence in engineering is seen as an eccentricity at best and an insult at worst, she works in silence. Her colleagues barely acknowledge her existence. When they do, it's with condescending smiles or thinly veiled comments about her place being elsewhere, anywhere but there. But Beatrice isn't there to make friends. She's there because she understands engines, she understands physics, and she understands that while others discuss theories in committee meetings, pilots are dying. The problem is maddeningly simple in its description, impossibly complex in its solution. During negative G maneuvers, when the aircraft inverts or dives, the fuel in the carburetor float chamber floods the engine. Too much fuel, not enough air. The engine drowns in its own sustenance. The standard carburetor, designed for normal flight conditions, becomes a death trap in combat. The official solution is on the way. Rolls-Royce is developing a pressure carburetor, a sophisticated system that will eliminate the problem entirely. But it will take months, perhaps a year, and the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Beatrice receives the assignment almost as an afterthought. Fix the carburetor problem. Find a temporary solution until the new system is ready. The tone is clear. We don't expect much, but someone needs to look at this. She spends days in the laboratory, reviewing test data, studying failure reports, listening to pilot testimonies. The pattern becomes clear. The solution, she realizes, might not require sophisticated engineering. It might require something much simpler, something almost embarrassingly obvious. A restrictor, a small brass disc with a hole in the center. Place it in the fuel line. Restrict the flow just enough to prevent flooding during negative G maneuvers. Not elegant, not sophisticated, but potentially effective. Her colleagues are skeptical. Too simple, they say. If the solution were that easy, someone would have thought of it already. Besides, restricting fuel flow could cause other problems. It hasn't been properly tested. The bureaucratic process requires months of validation, but Beatrice knows something they don't. She knows that in war, perfection is the enemy of good enough. She knows that a simple solution that works today is worth more than a perfect solution that arrives tomorrow. She looks at the small brass disc in her hand. Less than 2 inches in diameter, barely weighs anything. Could this tiny piece of metal be the difference between life and death for hundreds of pilots? There's only one way to find out, and it won't involve waiting for committee approval. The morning meeting at the Royal Aircraft Establishment is like all the others. 20 men in suits and lab coats, discussing specifications, tolerances, testing protocols. Beatrice sits in the corner, her notebook open, her brass prototype hidden in her pocket. Miss Shilling has a proposal, announces the department head, his tone suggesting this is merely a formality, a gesture toward inclusivity before moving on to serious matters. She stands, places the small brass disc on the table. The men lean forward, squinting at it. A restrictor, she says simply, installed in the fuel line. It limits flow during negative G maneuvers, prevents flooding. The silence that follows is not contemplative, it's dismissive. Too crude, says Henderson, the senior engineer. You're proposing to choke the fuel supply. What about power loss? What about engine performance at high altitude? The restriction is calculated, Beatrice responds, her voice steady. Small enough to prevent flooding, large enough to maintain performance. I've run the numbers. Numbers on paper, scoffs Morrison, lighting his pipe. Real engineering requires extensive testing, wind tunnel analysis, multiple prototypes. This is war machinery we're discussing, not household appliances. The comparison is deliberate. The message clear, this is not your domain. But Beatrice has spent weeks in the laboratory. She's reviewed every failure report, studied every pilot testimony. She's calculated fuel flow rates, pressure differentials, carburetor specifications. The mathematics don't lie. The solution works in theory. It should work in practice. How long will your extensive testing take? She asks. Henderson shifts in his chair. Proper validation, 6 months, minimum, perhaps 8. And how many pilots will die in 6 months? The room falls silent. The question hangs in the air, accusatory and uncomfortable. Miss Shilling, the department head intervenes. We all appreciate your enthusiasm, but engineering is not about quick fixes. It's about systematic analysis, rigorous testing, proper validation. We cannot simply install unproven modifications on military aircraft. Rolls-Royce is developing the proper solution, adds Henderson. The pressure carburetor will eliminate the problem entirely. We simply need to wait. Wait. That word again. As if waiting costs nothing. As if time is abundant. As if young men aren't falling from the sky every single day. Beatrice retrieves her brass disc from the table. She looks around the room at the faces of these men, intelligent men, educated men, men who understand engineering principles and bureaucratic protocols, men who have never sat in a Spitfire, men who have never felt an engine cut out at 400 miles per hour with a Messerschmitt on their tail. With respect, she says quietly, we don't have 6 months. That evening, Beatrice sits in her small apartment, the brass restrictor on her workbench. Through her window, she can hear the distant drone of aircraft engines, RAF fighters returning from patrol. She wonders how many didn't return. The official channels have failed. The bureaucracy is immovable. The committees will deliberate while pilots die. She picks up the brass disc, feels its weight in her palm. Sometimes she realizes, proper protocol is a luxury that war cannot afford. She needs a mechanic she can trust. She needs a pilot willing to fly with an unauthorized modification. She needs to break every rule in the Royal Aircraft Establishment Handbook. Tomorrow, she decides, she'll find Sergeant Cooper. Sergeant James Cooper has spent 15 years maintaining aircraft engines. He's seen modifications come and go, watched engineers propose solutions that look brilliant on paper and catastrophic in reality. He's also buried friends, pilots who died because their engines failed at the worst possible moment. When Beatrice approaches him in the hangar, he already knows what she's going to ask. It's unauthorized, he says, not looking up from the engine he's servicing. It works, she replies. You've tested it. In the laboratory. The mathematics are sound. Cooper finally looks at her. Mathematics don't fly, Miss Shilling, pilots do. She places the brass restrictor on his workbench. He picks it up, examines it against the light, runs his thumb over the precisely drilled hole. 1 test flight, Beatrice says. Install it on a single aircraft. If it fails, we remove it immediately. If it works? If it works, we're still court-martialed for unauthorized modifications to military equipment. If it works, we save lives. Cooper turns the restrictor in his fingers. He thinks about Jenkins, who died 3 weeks ago when his Hurricane's engine cut out during a dive. He thinks about Patterson, who barely managed to restart his Spitfire before hitting the ground. He thinks about all the young pilots who climb into their cockpits, knowing their own engines might kill them. Squadron Leader Davies is flying patrol tomorrow morning, he says finally. He's experienced. If anyone can evaluate the modification properly, it's him. He'll know about the modification. Cooper shakes his head. Better he doesn't. If something goes wrong, I want him reacting instinctively, not second-guessing the equipment. Besides, what he doesn't know can't get him court-martialed. That night, while the base sleeps, Cooper installs the restrictor in Davies and Spitfire. It takes less than 20 minutes. Such a small modification, such enormous implications. The next morning arrives with clear skies and good visibility. Perfect conditions for combat, perfect conditions for testing. Beatrice watches from the ground as Davies' Spitfire taxis to the runway. She's broken protocols, violated regulations, risked her career. If the modification fails, if the engine loses power at a critical moment, Davies could die, and his death would be on her hands. The Spitfire accelerates down the runway, lifts into the air, climbs toward the morning sun. Cooper stands beside her, arms crossed. Now we wait. But waiting becomes impossible when, 30 minutes into the patrol, the air raid sirens begin to wail. German bombers approaching from the south. The squadron scrambles to intercept. Beatrice's hands clench into fists. Davies will engage. He'll dive. He'll push the aircraft to its limits. The modification will be tested not in controlled conditions, but in actual combat, where margins for error don't exist. Through binoculars, she watches the distant specks of aircraft merge into a chaotic dogfight. Contrails slice across the blue sky. The sound of machine guns rattles like distant thunder. And somewhere up there, in a Spitfire with an unauthorized modification, Squadron Leader Davies is testing whether her calculations were correct or whether she's just signed his death warrant. The dogfight lasts 17 minutes. To Beatrice, I'm standing on the ground with her heart hammering against her ribs. It feels like 17 hours. She watches through binoculars as the aircraft twist and dive, predators and prey exchanging roles in seconds. She can't distinguish Davies' Spitfire from the others. She can only watch and wait and pray that her mathematics were correct. One by one, the aircraft return. She counts them obsessively. 3 Spitfires land. 4, 5. Cooper stands beside her, silent, his jaw clenched. The 6th Spitfire approaches the runway, Davies' aircraft. She recognizes the identification markings. The landing is smooth, textbook perfect. The Spitfire taxis toward the hangar. Beatrice feels her legs weaken with relief. Davies climbs out of the cockpit, removes his helmet, and she sees it immediately in his face. Something is different. He's animated, talking rapidly to his ground crew, gesturing emphatically. Cooper approaches him first. "Sast, how was the flight, sir?" "Extraordinary," Davies says, his voice still carrying the adrenaline of combat. "I engaged 2 Messerschmitts, had to dive twice to evade, full negative G both times, and the engine never missed a beat, not once. Usually I feel that hesitation, that moment of fear when the power cuts. But today, nothing. Just smooth, continuous power." He pauses, looks at Cooper with sudden suspicion. "Did you do something to my aircraft, Sergeant?" Cooper glances at Beatrice. She steps forward. "I did, Squadron Leader. I installed a modification, a fuel restrictor, without authorization." The silence that follows is dangerous. Davies could report her immediately. Should report her. Unauthorized modifications to military aircraft are grounds for dismissal, possibly prosecution. Instead, he laughs. Her short, sharp bark of laughter that carries equal parts disbelief and admiration. "You modified my aircraft without telling me. I needed a real-world test. The laboratory data was promising, but—" "Promising?" Davies interrupts. "Miss Shilling, I've been flying Spitfires for 2 years. I've lost count of how many times that bloody carburetor nearly killed me. Today was the first time I could dive without fear. The first time I could focus entirely on the enemy, instead of babysitting my own engine." He turns to his ground crew. "I want this modification on every aircraft in the squadron, today." "Sir," Cooper says carefully, "it's not authorized. We'd need approval from—" "Approval?" Davies' voice hardens. "Henderson, who's been killed by carburetor failure this month, Roberts, Williams, young Patterson, on his 5th mission. How many more need to die while we wait for approval?" Word spreads through the base like wildfire. Pilots gather around Davies' Spitfire. They want to see the modification. They want it installed on their aircraft. The small brass disc becomes the most discussed piece of equipment on the entire base. By afternoon, 3 more pilots are demanding the modification. By evening, it's 12. Squadron commanders are calling the Royal Aircraft Establishment, asking about this restrictor, asking why they haven't been informed, asking how quickly it can be mass-produced. Beatrice sits in her small office, listening to the growing commotion outside. She's violated every protocol. She's bypassed the entire chain of command. She's done something that, by every official measure, should end her career. But in the hangar, mechanics are working overtime, fabricating copies of her brass restrictor, installing them on aircraft that will fly tomorrow. And tomorrow, fewer pilots will die. The phone on her desk rings. She picks it up, knowing what's coming. "Miss Shilling," says the voice of her department head. "My office, immediately." The walk to the department head's office feels longer than usual. Beatrice carries her notebook, her calculations, her test data. Evidence for her defense, though she knows that in military bureaucracy, results rarely outweigh protocol violations. The office is crowded. Henderson is there, along with Morrison and 3 other senior engineers. The department head, Colonel Whitmore, sits behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Sit down, Miss Shilling." She sits, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. "You installed an unauthorized modification on a military aircraft," Whitmore begins. "You conducted an unsanctioned field test. You bypassed every safety protocol we have in place. Do you understand the severity of what you've done?" "I understand perfectly, sir." "Then perhaps you can explain why." Beatrice meets his gaze. "Because pilots were dying. Because we have a solution that works, and waiting for bureaucratic approval costs lives." Henderson leans forward. "Your solution hasn't been properly tested. One successful flight doesn't constitute validation. What about engine performance at different altitudes? What about fuel efficiency? What about long-term mechanical stress? What about the 16 pilots who died last month from carburetor failure?" Beatrice counters. "What about the 23 the month before? How many more need to die before we act?" "That's not the point," Morrison interjects. "Military engineering requires systematic processes. We can't simply—" "Gentlemen," Whitmore interrupts, raising his hand, "I've received 7 phone calls this morning. Squadron commanders, all asking about Miss Shilling's modification. They want it. Their pilots want it. Some have already had it installed." He pauses, opens a folder on his desk. "I've also received a call from Air Vice Marshal Park. He's heard about the modification. He wants to know why, if we have a solution that works, it isn't being implemented across the entire RAF." The room falls silent. "The proper solution is the pressure carburetor," Henderson says, but his voice lacks conviction now. "It will be ready in 8 months, Whitmore finishes. "Possibly longer. And in the meantime, Miss Shilling's restrictor appears to work. Davies flew 2 more missions yesterday. Both successful, no engine failures. He's written a report recommending immediate implementation." Whitmore looks at Beatrice. "You violated protocol. You risked your career. You could have caused a catastrophic failure that killed a pilot." "Yes, sir." "You also may have saved dozens of lives." He closes the folder. "Rolls-Royce has been contacted. They're reviewing your design. If they approve it for mass production, we'll begin installing it on every operational Spitfire and Hurricane in the RAF. Henderson's face reddens. "This sets a dangerous precedent. We can't allow—" "We're at war, Mr. Henderson," Whitmore says quietly. "Precedent is a luxury we can't afford. Results are what matter." He turns back to Beatrice. "You'll coordinate with Rolls-Royce on production specifications. You'll visit air bases to supervise installation. You'll write a detailed report on the modification's performance. And Miss Shilling—" "Yes, sir. Next time you decide to violate every regulation we have, at least have the courtesy to inform me first." The meeting ends. Beatrice walks out, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation is over. In the hallway, Cooper is waiting. How bad was it? They're approving the modification. Rolls-Royce will manufacture it. Installation begins next week. Cooper grins. "So you're not being court-martialed?" Apparently not. But as she returns to her office, Beatrice feels no triumph, only the weight of responsibility. Her small brass disc will now be installed on hundreds of aircraft. If she's made an error, if her calculations are wrong, the consequences will be catastrophic. She sits at her desk and begins reviewing her mathematics one more time. 3 months into implementation, the statistics are undeniable. Carburetor-related engine failures have dropped by 90%. RAF pilots report increased confidence in combat maneuvers. The number of successful intercepts has risen significantly. Squadron commanders write glowing reports about aircraft reliability. Beatrice travels between air bases, supervising installations, troubleshooting problems, training mechanics. She becomes a familiar figure in hangars across southern England, the woman with the notebook, who asks precise questions and accepts no shortcuts in installation procedures. The pilots call it Miss Shilling's orifice, a nickname that makes her colleagues uncomfortable, but that she accepts with quiet amusement. Better to be remembered for crude humour than not remembered at all. At RAF Hornchurch, a young pilot named Thompson approaches her after a briefing. He can't be more than 20 years old, his face still carrying the softness of adolescence. "Miss Shilling, I wanted to thank you. Last week, I had to dive on a Dornier, full negative G, exactly the situation that used to kill the engine. But it kept running, smooth as silk. I got the bomber and I came home. My fiancée, she's pregnant. I'm going to be a father." He shakes her hand, his grip firm and grateful, then walks away. Beatrice stands in the hangar, watching him go, and feels something break inside her chest. This is what her work means. Not statistics or reports or commendations. Real people, real lives, real futures that wouldn't exist without a small brass disc. But the weight of it is crushing. That night, in her apartment, she receives a telegram. Her husband, George Naylor, has been shot down over Germany. His Lancaster bomber was hit by anti-aircraft fire. 3 crew members were killed. George survived, but he's in a German hospital, a prisoner of war. She reads the telegram 3 times, her hands perfectly steady, her face expressionless. Then she folds it carefully, places it in a drawer, and returns to her calculations for a carburetor modification requested by Bomber Command. Work is easier than feeling, numbers are safer than emotions. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment, recognition comes slowly and grudgingly. Henderson still questions her methods. Morrison still makes comments about women in engineering. But the younger engineers seek her expertise, ask her opinions, treat her as an equal. She's invited to meetings she was previously excluded from. Her name appears on technical reports. She receives letters from pilots, from mechanics, from squadron commanders, all expressing gratitude. But she never receives a promotion, never assumes a leadership position. The glass ceiling in wartime engineering is transparent, but unbreakable. Colonel Whitmore calls her to his office one afternoon. "The pressure carburetor is ready," he says. "Rolls-Royce will begin installation next month. Your restrictor will be phased out." She nods. This was always temporary, a stopgap solution until the proper fix arrived. "Your modification saved lives, Miss Shilling. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. That matters more than any official recognition." "Does it, sir?" He looks at her for a long moment. "In war, Miss Shilling, heroes are rarely the ones who receive medals. They're the ones who do what needs to be done, regardless of cost." She leaves his office and returns to her laboratory. There's always another problem to solve, another modification to design, another life to save. The work, at least, never ends. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells ring across Britain. People flood the streets, celebrating the end of 6 years of war. In London, crowds gather outside Buckingham Palace, cheering, weeping, embracing strangers. Beatrice Shilling stands at her laboratory window, watching the celebrations in the distance. The pressure carburetor has long since replaced her restrictor. The immediate crisis is over. But her work continues, as it always has, in the quiet spaces where engineering meets necessity. She thinks about the numbers. Her modification was installed on thousands of aircraft. It was used in combat for 18 months. How many pilots survived because of it? How many went home to their families? How many children were born because their fathers didn't die in a failed dive? She'll never know the exact figure. Statistics don't capture individual lives, individual futures, individual moments of gratitude from young men who lived when they should have died. 3 months after the war ends, a letter arrives. Official stationery, Royal Seal. She's been appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire for her contributions to the war effort. The citation is brief, bureaucratic, mentioning technical innovations in aircraft engineering. No mention of the unauthorized test. No mention of violated protocols. No mention of the small brass disc that became one of the most significant modifications in RAF history. George returns from the prisoner of war camp in Germany, thinner, quieter, carrying scars both visible and hidden. They rebuild their life together in the slow, careful way of people who have survived trauma. Beatrice continues working. She becomes an expert in motorcycle engineering, breaking speed records, competing in trials, proving once again that technical expertise has no gender. But her wartime contribution fades from public memory, buried in classified reports and forgotten briefings. Years pass. Decades. The engineers who dismissed her retire or die. The pilots who flew with her modification grow old, telling stories to grandchildren about the war, about Spitfires, about the woman whose simple solution saved their lives. In 1990, a young engineering student researching wartime innovations discovers a reference to Miss Shilling's orifice in an archived RAF document. She investigates further, interviews surviving pilots, examines technical specifications. Her dissertation brings Beatrice's story back into light. Other researchers follow. Articles are written. Documentaries produced. Engineering schools begin teaching her story as an example of innovative thinking under pressure, of how simple solutions can be more effective than complex ones, of how one person's courage to break rules can save thousands of lives. Beatrice Shilling dies in 1990 at the age of 81. Her obituaries finally give her the recognition she never sought during her life. The woman who solved one of the RAF's most critical problems with a piece of brass smaller than a coin. The engineer who valued results over protocol, lives over procedures. Her legacy isn't found in medals or official commendations. It's found in the children and grandchildren of pilots who survived the war. It's found in every young woman who studies engineering and learns that gender is irrelevant to innovation. It's found in the understanding that sometimes the most brilliant solutions are the simplest ones. And it's found in a small brass restrictor, preserved in the RAF Museum, accompanied by a simple plaque, Miss Shilling's Orifice, a modification that changed the course of aerial warfare. Sometimes history is made not with grand gestures, but with precision, determination, and a willingness to act when others choose to wait.